Good morning, everybody. Sego Seguego, Ganyat Dahawa Yungats. My name is Rowen White. I'm a Mohawk seed keeper and farmer from a small community called Akwesasne, which is right on the New York-Canadian border. But I currently reside and farm in Northern California. I'm gonna pull up a few slides so you guys can see some beautiful pictures. I was gonna try and do some tutorials on corn braiding here this morning, but webcam is very limited, like it wasn't getting a good image. So I'm going to ask Sean also to drop a couple of videos in the chat that I've prepared. We've prepared a corn braiding tutorial, which comes from my people, as well as a short video on our work at Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. I'm going to go ahead and pop over here. Sean, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see those slides? You guys can see them? Perfect. Great.
Yes.
Great. Well, good day to everybody. I just wanted to, we have a short amount of time together, so I just want to try and move through some things rather swiftly, but I did want to honor and acknowledge that we're really coming up on a year of quite a transformative year, which has held a lot of difficulties and also some silver linings for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous farming. With the pandemic, we've had an incredible resurgence of people returning to traditional lifeways, including planting and saving seeds. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to share a little bit of some of our work with corn as a guest keynote here today. I will say that I have been farming for 25 years. I came to farming at 17 as someone who was deeply, my family was deeply impacted by the impacts of colonization and acculturation. But my grandparents were farmers, and so were my great-grandparents. And unfortunately, my parents' generation, there was a gap in farming corn in traditional ways. But when I was 17 years old, I found my way to an organic farm in Western Massachusetts and began a lengthy journey and love affair with corn. I began to uncover my deep appreciation for the biodiversity that my ancestors held and valued and appreciated, and began to experiment with some of our indigenous ways of planting corn in a Three Sisters format. As an indigenous woman who came to farming with a real interest in seed stories, corn stories, traditional planting methods, but also recognizing our ability to be indigenous and innovators and thinking about ways in which we could adapt some of our traditional corn varieties and our corn variety planting to modern layouts and planting, with the potential of even using tractors, adapting Three Sisters planting to a new format. I did some research while in college, which eventually evolved into my thesis work, which was around looking at the different ways in which traditional Three Sisters polyculture, with corn being sort of this trellis on which the beans would grow, and then the squash being the ground cover, could be adapted to more modern planting, and the ways in which modern organic farms could be integrating and scaling up polyculture in that way. So I did a lot of research around land equivalent ratios and was learning a lot about ways in which to incorporate these, sort of merge old and new, and really found that it's a true testament to the work of our ancestors who diligently kept corn alive, throughout the ages. This was really my initiation. It was sort of an unconventional rites of passage into becoming a seed keeper again and a corn grower. Many, many long days hoeing under the corn and beginning to really think about what were the seeds that fed my ancestors. Why were there no farmers in my community who were continuing to grow them, or very small amounts of farmers in our community growing them? And what would it take to bring vitality back to those seeds and bring them back into our community to begin to endeavor towards food and seed sovereignty? And so I eventually, that body of work evolved into my thesis, which was, I actually have it right here. It's a tattered tome. It's called Sustaining Diversity for Culture's Sake, Haudenosaunee Native Seed Conservation or Restoration. And really the focus of that body of work was really looking at the cultural dimension of biodiversity. And as we all know, many of us in the circle perhaps have a relationship with corn. Perhaps you've been blessed by her beauty, by her diversity, by her brilliance in your farm and gardens, and the diversity that we have, on Earth right now of corn mothers. I have a lot of different pictures here in the slide deck of all the different colors of corn. These are some corns that are ancestral to my people, the Haudenosaunee people. And we have over 20 different types, different varieties, different strains of corn that we carry in our ancestral and traditional bundles. And each one of those corn varieties has a very specific ceremonial connotation and meaning and traditions that are attached to them. And as I began as a young woman to explore the seeds of my ancestors and begin to reinitiate myself into a relationship, this co-evolutionary relationship with corn, I began to realize that the wisdom of my ancestors, which was that we as indigenous peoples, many peoples across the globe, recognize that the foundation for our resilience and our ability to evolve in the ever-changing face of our Mother Earth, whether it be natural changes that occur and or human-induced ones as such as climate change, that are key to our resilience is in our diversity. And so the way in which to safeguard such diversity is to encode that diversity culturally. So we would have a blue corn, and we maintained that blue corn separate from white corn or separate from red corn, very specifically because we needed that blue corn in order to give our babies their traditional names in our ceremonial longhouse. And so we needed to keep the seed separate. For any of those of you who've grown corn before, you've recognized it's quite a feat to keep different varieties of corn separate from one another because they're very promiscuous cross-pollinators. And so, but then we would have a red corn. This red corn here in the picture is a Mohawk red bread corn. It's a flower corn. This corn this cob of corn, this particular variety dwindled down to just one cob left on the whole earth. And it was rescued by one of my seed elders, Steve McComber, who lives up at Gotnawage, which is a Mohawk community in Quebec. And he had received this cob from an elder, and it was the only one in our communities left, and he revitalized it. There's been a lot of work that we've been doing in our Indigenous Seed Keepers Network to do heirloom and ancestral landrace restoration for our corns, because some of them have been significantly inbred because of the impacts of them just dwindling down to a few seeds. But we revitalized this corn. We did some restoration work on it. And then we collaborated with a beautiful Akwesasne Seed Sanctuary collaboration with the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and the Hudson Valley Seed Company. We were able to access land in our traditional planting grounds, which is right around Albany, New York, which is a much, the soil is more conducive to agriculture than our sort of riverside land at Akwesasne. And we were able to grow out 5 acres of this corn initially. I had done the multiplication of the original stock seed here in California, and then we sent it there. And now we have been able to grow over 5,000 pounds of that corn for redistribution in our communities. So it's been a real beautiful project to witness. And again, important to have that corn as we move forward. We also have calico corns, which are multicolored corns, which are needed for our children's ceremonies. And so again, you see the beautiful culturally encoding of biodiversity. And I think it's really important in this time as we endeavor to look at what the future of food might look like, especially in the face of climate change, to remember and to root back to the importance of making our farms and gardens and cooperative regional seed hubs be these enclaves of biodiversity. And what is the role of us as humans to, as modern humans, as we do the culture work, as we begin to move past this time of disconnection, cultural disconnection. Many of you probably live in what I would call a cultural diaspora, a way in which you are disconnected from your ancestry and your lineage and the way that you relate to the earth and to seeds and to the world. And so I think as we begin to imagine what the future of food and agriculture could look like, I think that cultural and spiritual elements need to be woven back in as we begin to really have durable and sustainable as we can imagine that there would be sort of this durable, sustainable biodiversity included in our work. And so I have had the great pleasure of working with people like Roberto Cintley Rodriguez, this wonderful book. It's called Our Sacred Maize is Our Mother, as well as Virginia Nazaria, who wrote this amazing book called Cultural Memory and Biodiversity. I would highly recommend you looking at that. I can type the books into the chat after we're done with this. And then also another book that has had a great impact on me is called The Unlikely Piece at Cuchamaquik by Martine Prechtel. And these all these books in various ways really help us imagine this beautiful reweaving of some stories that could potentially help us as we move forward with reimagining what the future of food could look like. Corn has been an amazing teacher for me. I said before, she's taken me through a very unconventional rites of passage as I reckon with what it means to be an Indigenous woman in this modern era. In our Mohawk tradition, our traditional rites of passage when somebody moves from being a young child into young adulthood and then eventually into full adulthood, we have a rites of passage that we call ohologo, which actually means under the husk, so under the husk of corn. And so we actually imagine, I have a cob of corn here, we actually imagine that the young people in our community are these soft little kernels. And for those of you who've grown corn, it goes through a beautiful milky corn phase where those seeds, those nascent seeds, those kernels that will eventually become seeds are very tender and need that sort of protective husk and wrapping around. And so as a part of corn as metaphor or corn as a symbol, we recognize that understanding how much corn has played into shaping us as people, right? And so this brings us into a deeper understanding of the intergenerational responsibility to care for seeds and for food. This is a braid of that Mohawk red bread corn at the seed sanctuary that I braided. This is my daughter quite a number of years ago holding a braid that she had helped make. And so there's a real importance as seed keepers, as cultural memory keepers, that we keep those intergenerational connections alive, because as we bring our young people through their rites of passage and hand them down this information of what it means to be Mohawk, we actually hand them down bundles of seed and cultural knowledge for them to know what it means to take care of those seeds. And we actually involve ourselves in a planting ceremony, a ritual where we recreate our creation story as a garden. And we begin to tell the stories of our creation through the planting of seed and through the tending of that garden, and then eventually through eating that food. Because we actually, in our creation stories, we believe that we are the lineal descendants of the corn that feeds us every day. So sometimes modern folks have a hard time recognizing that, but I guarantee you that each and every one of you who are listening here today descend from people who at some point along in their history have a rich cosmology wherein plants play a central role, and that there is an understanding of plants being woven into our worldview, our cosmovision, and what I like to call our cosmogenealogy, the way in which we descend. So in our creation story, I don't have the time to tell it all, but we believe that we came from a place called Skyworld, and through a number of circumstances, there was a young woman who was asked to endeavor to move into this world that was a watery abyss, which is the world we inhabit now. And she fell in there clutching a few seeds in her hand. And when she fell into this new realm, she landed on the back of a turtle, which is what we know of as Turtle Island, which is North America. And she began to sing the world awake. She was pregnant at the time. And when she came through, her time there learning, everything becomes alive and growing as we know it today. She gives birth to a young daughter, and the two of them continue to sing this world into being. And as the world comes to life in this place, and the young girl is growing into a young woman, so there are two women, she becomes pregnant by the west wind and eventually gives birth to twins. Now, when she's giving birth, one of the twins of creation, who kind of creates all the good things on earth, is born naturally, and the twin who is sort of responsible for all the sort of challenging things on earth actually is born through her armpit, and in so doing kills the mother in childbirth. Now, in her dying breaths, when she is laying there on Turtle Island, she tells her descendants, her children, as well as her mother, and says, "From my body, the foods that will sustain the people will grow from my grave, will grow from my body." And from her breasts grew the corn, the sacred corn, and from her hands grew the beans, and from her belly button grew the squash vines, and from her legs grew the original potatoes and the sunflowers, and from her head grew the tobacco, which we use in our prayers, and from her heart grew the strawberry. And so it's not just we think of seeds like relatives, they actually are our relatives. We descend from that corn. And so we are told that those creation stories never end. And as we teach our young people to join back into this cultural inheritance of carrying corn and seed down from generation to generation, we actually replant that Skywoman's garden each and every year, because we remind ourselves and our young ones that those creation stories still happen every single season. And it's a part of our renewal of that understanding and our responsibility to those seeds to take care of them. Because a long, long time ago, our ancestors came into agreements with those seeds that we would take care of them and they would take care of us, right? And through a lot of changes in the last 400 years because of the colonial project, genocide, acculturation, assimilation, many indigenous peoples in my community and many other communities across Turtle Island have had a lot of challenges and adversities to uphold their side of the agreement to take care of these seeds. But what we're seeing right now is this incredible resurgence of enthusiasm and understanding of how important it is for our indigenous identity to continue to make sure that we have a relationship to those seeds. And as we move forward into the future, we are making sure that our food systems that we are building are at the heart relational and what we call kin-centric. So recognizing that that these relationships are key to the health and vitality of our food systems and distribution networks as a whole. And so it's vitally important that we're keeping not only the seeds alive and these corn seeds evolving, continuing to evolve, in this current modern time, but keeping that cultural memory and those seed stories alive. What I'd like to sort of bring into focus here, just because we are at a grain forum and we are recognizing all the ways in which we can integrate new and interesting grains into our lives, is that many of you who've had the blessing of growing corn, that is an incredible indigenous innovation. Corn was a gift of countless generations of indigenous plant breeders who using a very intuitive and also a very empirical way of selecting seeds across time. We know now that the origins of corn are incredible. There's these elements inside of corn called transposable elements or jumping genes that really contributed to the massive evolutionary leap that corn made from the humble teosinte grain. Maybe some of you have had the opportunity to grow teosinte, which is one of the wild progenitors of corn. It was indigenous ancestors who coaxed this amazing prism of corn from those humble teosinte seeds over a series of selective breeding across time. And the incredible explosion of biodiversity that has come forth from that. We really need to begin to have accountability around origins and honor the long lineage of seed keepers, indigenous seed keepers who have made such an immense contribution to the global food system and to that network. And so we're beginning with Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, who I work with through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. We're beginning to work with seed companies and various seed distributors to begin to initiate a conversation around what we call indigenous seed benefit sharing. So understanding the stewardship chain that seeds have come through, that we often have sacred protocols around how seeds should be treated and cared for and honored. And so how can we engage in a conversation with many people who are growing these indigenous seeds to understand what it means to be a respectful recipient of seed, right? And I think we don't often think about that enough in this modern time. In this era of sort of one-click shopping online, we really don't have that vibrant kinship and indigenous trade routes intact as much as we used to, which when seeds were passed through barter and through trade and through sharing as gifts, there was often an acknowledgement of the protocol by which people would tell the recipient of seed how to care for these seeds, that there was a cultural continuum, there was an understanding of the relationships inherent and the responsibilities to care for corn. And so now I see you can go to Baker Creek and buy corn that is a descendant of Pawnee Eagle corn, which again, I think the Pawnee haven't given permission for Baker Creek to sell that seed, right? And so how do we reconcile in this time to work interculturally? I think there's so much rich work that can be done. We've done a lot of this through our seed rematriation work, where we're working with non-native entities like seed banks and seed companies and museums and universities, and building trusting relationships between those non-native entities and indigenous communities to bring some of those seeds home and to share some of that indigenous protocol. So we've been working to cultivate a conversation with, again, seed companies and seed distributors to just begin to reckon with what does it mean to share and sell those seeds that come from a lineage other than yours, and how do you best honor and respect the contributions that indigenous peoples have made so that that seed could be here today, and how do we honor those stories and all of that. So if folks are interested in learning a little bit more about how to be involved in that conversation about indigenous seed benefit sharing, would love to get you in the loop. At the end of this presentation, I'm happy to share my contact information so you guys can stay in touch on that particular movement that's happening. This is a beautiful, this is the multicolored corn in the basket that I was telling you about, that's for our children's ceremony. We also have some incredible presentations of corn that come when you allow a corn to be a landrace, when you allow that inherent diversity, when you're not honing in that uniformity that I think the industrial food system is so good at doing, just sort of continuing towards that homogeneity. In a lot of our indigenous land races, you see these beautiful expressions of corn. This one is a fasciation of an ear, so it's kind of like multiple cobs sort of merging together we call this type of corn bear paw. It looks like a mitt or sort of a bear paw. And so you can imagine as you begin to build relationships and cultivate relationships with growing some of these landrace indigenous corns, that there's an incredible spectrum of shapes and sizes and flavors and colors that we have access to and that we can learn from. Um, so definitely excited to hear more from others, into the future, how we might, the corns that you're growing, the corns that are from your region. We have a seed bank here on our farm. We steward over 400 different varieties of a multitude of crops, but we have about 20 corns that we grow in rotation across the seasons. We have 3 isolation plots on our farm. We have a 10-acre farm, and we have about 2.5 acres under cultivation at any one time. And so we have separate isolation plots for our corn to keep them true to type. We really focus on growing stock seed, and then we work with other growers and entities to do big multiplication to be able to get the seeds in larger quantity out to people. We are currently working on developing our first prototype for a regional indigenous seed cooperative. We are working, our first network that we're engaging is in the upper Midwest. So we have a large group, we have a working group of over 80 indigenous growers that are working together, mostly working with corn, but beans and squash and other indigenous crops. And we are building towards a worker-owned cooperative, which will integrate regenerative economic principles that align with our cultural values. So what are ways in which we can honor our relationships and our cosmologies and our cultural values at the same time as providing economic support and incentive to those indigenous growers who are growing those seeds for distribution in our community. This last year and during the COVID pandemic, there was a great resurgence for indigenous peoples to return to the land and to begin to grow. With the supply chain shortages and food shortages in rural regions, but what we recognized is that there was a shortage of seeds to be had. We ran a big seed drive, and we many communities, we assisted them to run seed drives, but there just wasn't enough seed to really meet the demand. And I think we're seeing that across the board, even outside of indigenous communities. And so we're actually helping in our native communities, especially in the upper Midwest. We're starting there, as well as some communities in Oklahoma. We are facilitating what we call a seed sovereignty assessment, which is working with a community to assess the state and health of seed in that community. So understanding what seeds exist, who has what knowledge, what capacities to scale up, what is the demand for seed, where are seeds being procured outside of the community, and running sort of seed censuses is what we're calling them. So we get a sense of what corns and seeds exist there. And then that offers us the ability to map out a blueprint so that each community is working towards scaling up and bridging that gap so that they would have access to the right amount of seed. I think we oftentimes don't really think about in our food systems work, we don't ask ourselves the question, how much seed does it take to feed a community? And so that's a question that we're starting to ask as we endeavor to make sure that our people have access to seed, because as we begin to revitalize indigenous planting systems, it's not a one seed fits all, right? Like these traditional planting systems and evolving them into modern contexts, we require varieties that are culturally significant and also culturally appropriate, that have evolved hand in hand with some of these traditional planting techniques. We also, again, recognize the cultural significance and importance that those relationships bring into our life. And so we are working diligently to ensure that our communities have access to culturally significant seeds, as well as understanding the agronomic pieces there, which is that having seeds that are regionally adapted. So in places like the upper Midwest, seeds, certain varieties thrive there versus communities that we're working with in the Southwest, where it's an arid environment.
And Rowan, this is Sean. I just wanted to jump in, and we're to be a good timekeeper, to do my best to keep us on track. We're pretty much out of time. These
Okay,
things go so fast. But
I know
if there
it
was
sure
any
does.
last,
I'm used to. Yeah, well, I thank you all. And again, I'm just
yeah,
going to flip to the last slide here and just
sure.
be able to give a vision for what my contact info is. So that's a little bit of how you can support our work. That's our website, and that's how you can find us on Instagram, which is where we do a lot of our connecting and communicating with our circle. So thanks everybody for having me here.